My father will get me out of this court.
The courtroom fell silent, not the kind of silence that comes from respect, not the polite quiet of an audience waiting for a verdict. This was different. This was the silence of 47 people holding their breath at once, watching something they never expected to witness unfold before their very eyes. Standing at the defendant's table, her designer heels clicking against the marble floor one final time, was 24-year-old Victoria Ashworth Caldwell. Daughter of United States Senator Raymond Caldwell, granddaughter of a Supreme Court justice, great-granddaughter of an oil tycoon whose name still adorned 3 buildings in downtown Los Angeles. She had walked into this courtroom 90 minutes ago with the confidence of someone who had never been told no in her entire life. She had smiled at the cameras. She had waved at the reporters. She had adjusted her $3,000 blazer and whispered something to her attorney that made him chuckle nervously. Now that same woman stood frozen. Her perfectly manicured hands trembled against the wooden table. Her porcelain skin had turned a shade of white that makeup could never achieve. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. And sitting behind the bench, his weathered hands folded calmly in front of him, was the Honorable Judge Joseph Wapner, 71 years old, 38 years on the bench, a man who had seen everything, a man who feared nothing. A man whose silence could speak louder than any gavel. He hadn't raised his voice once. He hadn't interrupted her. He hadn't needed to, because what Judge Wapner did in those final 12 minutes would become the most watched courtroom moment of the decade. This is the story of how Victoria Ashworth Caldwell walked into a courtroom believing she was untouchable, and how she walked out with her entire world shattered into pieces so small, even her father's billions couldn't put them back together. To understand what happened on that Tuesday morning in the Los Angeles County Courthouse, you first need to understand who Victoria Ashworth Caldwell was, or rather, who she believed herself to be. Born on a crisp October morning in 1989, Victoria entered the world in a private wing of Johns Hopkins Hospital, surrounded by more security than most presidents. Her father, Raymond Caldwell, had already served 2 terms as a state senator and was eyeing his first federal campaign. Her mother, Elizabeth Ashworth, came from old money so old that the family had stopped counting generations ago. From her first breath, Victoria was different, not because of any particular talent or gift, but because she was raised to believe that rules were suggestions written for other people, that consequences were abstract concepts that applied to the unfortunate masses. That her last name was a skeleton key that could open any door, close any investigation, and silence any critic. The stories about her childhood read like a catalog of privilege gone wrong. At 7 years old, she crashed a golf cart into the window of her private school's administration building. The school apologized to her family. At 12, she was caught shoplifting at a boutique in Georgetown, not because she needed anything, but because she wanted to see what would happen. The store sent flowers to her mother the next day. At 16, she rear-ended 3 parked cars on her way to a birthday party. The police officer who responded was transferred to night patrol in the city's most dangerous district the following week. His name was never mentioned again. By the time Victoria reached her 20s, she had developed a reputation that preceded her like a storm warning. The tabloids called her Washington's wild child. The society pages called her Senator's stunning socialite. But the people who actually encountered her, the waiters, the valets, the assistants, the flight attendants, they had other names for her, names that never made it to print. She collected DUI charges like other women collected handbags, 4 and 5 years, each one mysteriously reduced to a traffic violation, each one buried under sealed documents and confidential settlements. She was photographed leaving nightclubs in 3 countries, always with a drink in her hand, always with a sneer on her face, always with an army of lawyers one phone call away. And through it all, Senator Raymond Caldwell stood by his daughter, not with the quiet support of a loving father who believed in redemption, but with the aggressive protection of a man who saw his daughter's behavior as an extension of his own invincibility. The senator had once been quoted at a private fundraiser saying something that would later become disturbingly relevant. He said that his family existed on a different plane of reality, that laws were tools they used to govern others, that justice was a performance staged for the public. He was about to discover exactly how wrong he was. The night of March 14, 2013, started like any other night for Victoria Caldwell. She had spent the afternoon at a spa in Beverly Hills, followed by cocktails at a rooftop bar with a group of women she called friends but treated like staff. By 9 o'clock, Victoria had consumed 4 glasses of champagne. By 11, she had switched to vodka. By midnight, she was behind the wheel of her white Range Rover, weaving through the streets of Santa Monica with her music loud enough to rattle the windows of the cars beside her. What happened next would be pieced together from security cameras, witness statements, and the cracked screen of a cell phone that somehow survived the impact. At exactly 12:47 a.m., Victoria ran a red light at the intersection of Wilshire Boulevard and 26th Street. She was traveling at an estimated 53 miles per hour in a 35 zone. Her blood alcohol level would later be measured at nearly 3 times the legal limit. But the tragedy wasn't the speed. It wasn't even the alcohol. The tragedy was the 2006 Honda Civic that had the legal right-of-way. The modest sedan driven by a 43-year-old nurse named Patricia Reyes, who was on her way home after a double shift at St. John's Hospital. Patricia never saw the Range Rover coming. Neither did her passengers, her 2 children, Miguel, age 11, Isabella, age 8. The impact was catastrophic. The Honda was struck on the driver's side with such force that it spun 3 complete rotations before coming to rest against a fire hydrant. Water sprayed into the night air, mixing with the shattered glass that covered the street like glitter at a funeral. Victoria's Range Rover barely had a scratch. The engineering miracle of modern luxury vehicles had protected her from the consequences of her own actions. She stumbled out of the driver's seat, looked at the destroyed Honda, and did something that witnesses would never forget. She laughed, not nervously, not in shock, but with genuine, dismissive amusement, as if she had knocked over a display at a store rather than destroyed a family in an instant. Then she pulled out her phone and made a call, not to 911. Not to report the accident, but to her father's personal attorney. Witnesses heard her say something that would later be played in court. She said she needed someone to clean this up because she had a brunch meeting in the morning and didn't want to be tired. Patricia Reyes died at the scene. Miguel, the 11-year-old boy who dreamed of becoming a firefighter, passed away in the ambulance. Little Isabella survived, but she would never walk again. She would never run through a park. She would never dance at her quinceañera. She would spend the rest of her life in a wheelchair, haunted by memories of her mother's voice and her brother's laughter. And Victoria Ashworth Caldwell stood on that street corner, complaining that the flashing police lights were giving her a headache. The case should have been straightforward. 3 eyewitnesses, security camera footage, a blood alcohol level that left no room for interpretation. Victoria Caldwell had killed 2 people and destroyed a third. The evidence was overwhelming, but nothing involving the Caldwell family was ever straightforward. Within hours of the accident, Senator Raymond Caldwell activated a legal defense machine that most people didn't know existed. A team of 14 attorneys, 3 private investigators, and 2 public relations specialists descended upon Lowe's angels like locusts. Their strategy was as predictable as it was infuriating. Attack the victim, bury the evidence. Delay the proceedings until the public lost interest. They began by suggesting that Patricia Reyes had also been impaired, despite toxicology reports that showed nothing in her system except caffeine from the hospital coffee she had consumed during her shift. They implied that her car had mechanical problems, despite a maintenance record that proved otherwise. They even attempted to argue that the traffic light had malfunctioned, until city records showed it had been inspected 2 weeks prior. For 18 months, the case crawled through the system. Hearings were postponed, documents were lost. Witnesses found themselves under investigation for unrelated matters that seemed curiously timed. Isabella Reyes, now orphaned and paralyzed, was placed in the care of an aunt who could barely afford the mounting medical bills. The family had no money for attorneys. They had no connections to politicians. They had only their grief and a fading hope that the system would eventually work. Meanwhile, Victoria Caldwell continued living her life as if nothing had happened. She was photographed at charity galas. She was spotted at exclusive restaurants. She gave an interview to a sympathetic magazine in which she described herself as a victim of circumstance and suggested that the accident had actually made her a stronger person. The public was outraged. But outrage, as Victoria had learned, was something that passed. What Victoria didn't account for was the quiet determination of the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office. And she certainly didn't account for the man who would ultimately preside over her trial, a man who had been randomly assigned to her case, a man whose very presence would change everything. Judge Joseph Wapner. Joseph Wapner was not a celebrity judge. He didn't seek cameras. He didn't give interviews. He didn't have a catchphrase or a television show or a ghost-written memoir. What he had was something far more dangerous to someone like Victoria Caldwell. He had integrity. Born in 1919 in Los Angeles, Wapner had served in World War II, earned a Bronze Star with Oak Leaf Cluster, and survived combat that would have broken lesser men. He returned home, finished law school, and dedicated his life to the pursuit of something that many people talked about but few genuinely believed in. Justice, real justice, the kind that doesn't check bank accounts or political affiliations before making its judgments. By the time Victoria's case landed on his docket, Wapner had presided over more than 3,000 cases. He had seen wealthy defendants try to buy their way out of accountability. He had seen powerful families attempt to manipulate the system, and he had developed a particular skill for handling them. He didn't shout, he didn't lecture, he simply asked questions. Quiet, precise questions that exposed the truth like a surgeon's scalpel exposing a tumor. His silences were legendary. Attorneys who had faced him described the experience as being slowly dismantled by someone who never raised their voice. Victoria's legal team made their first mistake on the opening day of trial. They underestimated him completely. Lead attorney Jeffrey Blackwell, a Harvard-educated defense attorney who had never lost a case in 15 years, walked into the courtroom with the attitude of someone collecting a fee rather than fighting a battle. He smiled at Judge Wapner as if they were old golf buddies. He made a joke about the traffic that had delayed his arrival. He referred to the proceedings as a formality that would soon be resolved. Judge Wapner said nothing. He simply looked at Blackwell with an expression that made the attorney's smile slowly fade. The silence lasted 11 seconds, long enough for everyone in the room to understand that the rules had changed. Victoria, seated at the defendant's table in a muted gray dress that her stylist had chosen to convey humility, sensed something different about this judge, but she dismissed it. She had dismissed authority figures her entire life. This one would be no different. She was catastrophically wrong. The prosecution presented its case with methodical precision. Witness after witness took the stand. The convenience store clerk who had sold Victoria the vodka bottles just hours before the accident, the bartender who had watched her drink herself into oblivion, the parking attendant who had warned her not to drive and been dismissed with a wave of her hand, and then came the footage. 27 seconds of security camera video that showed the moment of impact in unflinching detail. The courtroom watched as the white Range Rover ran the red light. They watched as it struck the Honda with enough force to fold the smaller car nearly in half. They heard the gasp from the jury box. They saw the forewoman cover her mouth with both hands. Victoria showed no reaction. She had been coached to appear neutral, to show neither guilt nor indifference. But what came across was something else entirely. It was emptiness, the complete absence of human connection to the tragedy playing out on the screen before her. Isabella Reyes was wheeled into the courtroom to testify. Now 10 years old with eyes that held wisdom no child should possess, she sat in her wheelchair and answered questions about the night her family died. She described her mother's voice telling her to hold on. She described her brother's hand in hers in those final moments. She described waking up in a hospital and learning that everyone she loved was gone. The jury wept openly. Several spectators had to leave the room. Even the seasoned court reporter paused to wipe her eyes, and then came Victoria's defense. Attorney Blackwell rose with what he believed was a master strategy. He would not deny that Victoria was driving. He would not deny the alcohol. Instead, he would shift the narrative. He would suggest that Victoria was herself a victim of enabling. A victim of pressure, a victim of a society that had failed to give her proper guidance. He called witnesses who testified to Victoria's difficult childhood, the pressure of being a senator's daughter, the expectations, the scrutiny. He painted a picture of a young woman crying out for help in the only way she knew how. It was a strategy that might have worked with a different judge. A judge who was impressed by credentials, a judge who responded to connections, a judge who could be swayed by the presence of power. Judge Wapner was none of those things. He listened to every word of the defense's case with the same calm attention he had shown the prosecution. He took notes in his precise handwriting. He asked occasional clarifying questions, and he watched Victoria Caldwell with eyes that seemed to see straight through her carefully constructed facade. Then came the moment that would define the entire trial. Against the advice of her attorneys, Victoria Caldwell decided to testify on her own behalf. It was a decision that surprised everyone in the courtroom, and it was a decision that would prove to be her complete undoing. She took the stand wearing a different outfit, a softer dress, minimal jewelry, her hair pulled back in a style that suggested innocence rather than privilege. She had practiced her expressions in front of a mirror. She knew exactly when to look sad, when to look remorseful, when to let a single tear escape. She was a performer, and she was about to give the performance of her life. Under questioning from her own attorney, Victoria painted a portrait of herself as a fundamentally good person who had made a terrible mistake. She spoke about her charity work. She mentioned the scholarship fund her family had established in Patricia Reyes' name. She described her sleepless nights, her therapy sessions, her spiritual awakening. She said all the right words. She hit all the right notes. She was everything her lawyers had coached her to be. And then the prosecution began its cross-examination. Assistant District Attorney Maria Santos was a career prosecutor who had grown up in the same neighborhood where Patricia Reyes had lived. She understood loss in ways that Victoria Caldwell could never comprehend. And she understood exactly how to expose the truth. She started with simple questions, factual questions, questions that seemed almost friendly. Where was Victoria that night? What had she been drinking? How was she feeling when she got behind the wheel? Victoria answered confidently. She had memorized the timeline. She had rehearsed these responses. She felt herself relaxing. That was when Santos changed her approach. She asked Victoria if she remembered what she had said to the first police officer on the scene. Victoria hesitated. She said she had been in shock. She couldn't remember clearly. Santos produced the officer's body camera footage. The courtroom watched as Victoria, standing beside the wreckage of her Range Rover, told the officer that she needed this to disappear because her father would be very disappointed if it made the news. They watched her laugh at something only she found funny. They watched her apply lip gloss while paramedics tried desperately to save Miguel Reyes' life just 50 feet away. Victoria's composure cracked slightly, a tightening around her eyes, a subtle change in her posture, but she recovered. She explained that she had been in a dissociative state, that her behavior wasn't really her. Santos moved forward. She asked Victoria if she remembered the phone call she made to her father's attorney. Victoria said she did. Santos asked her to explain what she meant by asking someone to clean this up. Victoria's answer was rehearsed. She said she had been referring to getting legal help, to making sure her rights were protected. Santos let the answer hang in the air for a moment, then she asked a question that would echo through the rest of the trial. She asked Victoria if she was aware that while she was on the phone with the attorney, Isabella Reyes was trapped in the back seat of the Honda, calling out for her mother. She asked if Victoria had heard the child's screams. She asked if Victoria had done anything at all to help the people her car had just struck. Victoria's face hardened. For just a moment, the mask slipped completely. And in that moment, everyone in the courtroom saw who she really was. She said she hadn't heard anything. She said the music was too loud. She said she assumed someone else would handle it. Santos let the silence stretch. Then she asked her final question. He asked Victoria if, looking back, there was anything she would have done differently that night. And Victoria made the mistake that would define her. She said yes, she would have taken a different route home because there was less traffic and she probably wouldn't have been caught. The words landed like bombs. The jury foreman visibly recoiled. The court reporter stopped typing. The spectators erupted in shocked whispers. Victoria immediately tried to correct herself. She said she had misspoken. She said she was nervous. She said she hadn't meant it that way, but it was too late. The truth had escaped, and everyone had heard it. What happened next would become a masterclass in judicial authority, a demonstration of how true power operates. Not through shouting, not through theatrics, but through the careful, methodical exposure of truth. Judge Wapner had remained silent throughout Victoria's testimony. He had taken notes, he had observed, he had waited. Now, as the prosecution rested its case, the defense called for a recess. Attorney Blackwell needed time to regroup, time to rebuild Victoria's shattered credibility, time to remind the jury of reasonable doubt and the burden of proof. Judge Wapner denied the request. He said quietly that the court had heard quite enough testimony and that he had some questions of his own for the defendant. This was unusual. In most cases, judges remain neutral observers. They do not directly question defendants, but this was within his rights, and Victoria had no choice but to remain on the stand. What followed was 15 minutes that would be studied in law schools for decades to come. Judge Wapner began by asking Victoria about her education. She answered proudly. Princeton, a degree in art history, magna cum laude. He asked about her travels. She described homes in 4 countries, vacations on private islands, a yacht that her family kept in the Mediterranean. He asked about her work history. She hesitated. She had never held a job, not a real one. She had been on the board of some charities. She had attended fundraising events. Wapner nodded at each answer. His expression remained completely neutral. He was building something, layer by layer, brick by brick. Then he asked Victoria if she knew what a double shift at a hospital felt like. She said she didn't. He asked if she knew what it meant to choose between paying rent and buying groceries. She said she couldn't imagine. He asked if she knew what it felt like to kiss your children goodbye in the morning and wonder if you'd be able to afford their school supplies that week. She said nothing. Judge Wapner let the silence build. Then he spoke again. He said he had reviewed Victoria's financial records. He noted that in the month following the accident, she had spent approximately $43,000 on personal expenses, clothes, jewelry, travel. He noted that this amount was more than Patricia Reyes had earned in an entire year of saving lives at the hospital. Victoria's attorney objected. He said the judge was editorializing. He said this was beyond the scope of proper judicial questioning. Judge Wapner turned to the attorney with an expression that made the man visibly shrink in his expensive suit. He asked if counsel was attempting to instruct the court on proper procedure. He suggested that counsel might want to reconsider that approach. The attorney sat down immediately. Wapner continued. He asked Victoria if she had personally visited Isabella Reyes during the 18 months between the accident and the trial. Victoria said she had been advised not to by her lawyers. He asked if Victoria had written Isabella a letter. Victoria said her legal team thought it might be used against her. He asked if Victoria had done anything at all, anything of her own initiative that didn't involve lawyers or public relations specialists, to acknowledge the human beings whose lives she had destroyed. Victoria began to cry, real tears this time, not the calculated emotion of earlier, but the tears of someone watching their carefully constructed defense collapse around them. She said she wanted to. She said she had thought about it. She said she was told it would make things worse. Judge Wapner's next words were delivered so quietly that the entire courtroom leaned forward to hear them. He said that in all his years on the bench, he had seen defendants who were truly remorseful. He said he could recognize genuine transformation, genuine understanding, genuine humanity. He paused. Then he said he had not seen any of those things from Victoria Caldwell. The courtroom gasped. Cameras flashed despite the rules against them. Victoria's mother, seated in the front row, began to sob, but Judge Wapner wasn't finished. He continued, his voice never rising above its measured tone. He spoke directly to Victoria, but he was really speaking to everyone in the room, to the jury, to the spectators, to the cameras that would broadcast this moment across the world. He said that he had been a judge for nearly 4 decades. He said that in that time he had sentenced murderers who showed more humanity than what he had witnessed in this courtroom. He said that he had seen gang members, career criminals, and people society had written off entirely who demonstrated more genuine remorse than the daughter of one of America's most powerful senators. Victoria tried to speak. She tried to explain. She tried to say that she was different now, that she had changed, that she understood the weight of what she had done. Judge Wapner raised one hand, just slightly, just enough to stop her mid-sentence. He said that he had observed Victoria throughout this trial. He said he had watched her expressions during the testimony about Patricia Reyes's final moments. He said he had seen no grief, no shock, no human reaction at all. He said he had watched Victoria check her manicure while Isabella described her brother dying beside her. The jury members shifted uncomfortably. Several of them were openly glaring at Victoria now. He said that in his experience, true remorse couldn't be taught by lawyers. It couldn't be coached by public relations experts. It couldn't be purchased with donations to charity funds that bore the victim's name. He said that true remorse lived in the sleepless nights, in the inability to enjoy simple pleasures, in the constant knowing awareness that your actions had ended lives that mattered, dreams that would never be fulfilled, a future that would never arrive. He asked Victoria directly if she had experienced any of those things. Victoria nodded desperately. She said yes. She said she couldn't sleep. She said she thought about it all the time. Judge Wapner leaned forward slightly. He asked Victoria what colored dress Isabella had been wearing the night of the accident. Victoria's face went blank. She didn't know. He asked what Patricia Reyes's profession was. Victoria paused. She said she thought she was a nurse or maybe a doctor. She wasn't sure. He asked what Miguel had wanted to be when he grew up. Victoria said nothing. She hadn't known there was a boy, or she had forgotten. Or she had never cared enough to learn. The silence that followed was devastating. Judge Wapner leaned back in his chair. He said that a person who truly carried the weight of 2 deaths would know everything about the lives she had taken. She would know their names without prompting. She would know their dreams. She would know their favorite foods and their childhood memories and the small details that made them human beings rather than statistics. He said that Victoria knew none of those things because Victoria had never seen Patricia and Miguel as human beings at all. She had seen them as inconveniences, as obstacles to her evening, as problems to be cleaned up. Victoria's attorney rose to object. He said the judge was being prejudicial. He said this was grounds for a mistrial. He said Senator Caldwell would be filing formal complaints. Judge Wapner's response was delivered with ice in every word. He said that threats and intimidation might work in Washington. They might work in boardrooms and country clubs and private jets, but they did not work in his courtroom. He said that in his courtroom, the law applied equally to everyone, to the senator's daughter and the nurse's daughter alike. He said that if counsel wished to file complaints, that was his right. But he should be aware that Judge Wapner had been threatened by men far more dangerous than politicians, and those men were now serving life sentences while he was still wearing his robe. The attorney sat down so quickly that his chair nearly tipped over. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. It was one of the shortest deliberations in Los Angeles County history for a case of this magnitude. Everyone knew what the verdict would be before it was read: guilty on all counts. 2 counts of vehicular manslaughter while intoxicated, 1 count of driving under the influence causing great bodily injury, 1 count of felony hit and run. Victoria stood motionless as the verdicts were read. Her face had gone completely white. Her hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly that her knuckles looked like they might break through her skin. Behind her, Senator Raymond Caldwell sat in stunned silence. His wife had collapsed against him, weeping. His team of attorneys were already on their phones, planning appeals that everyone knew would fail. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 4 weeks later, but Judge Wapner had one more thing to say before dismissing the jury. He addressed Victoria directly for the last time. He said that when she came back for sentencing, she would learn the consequences of her actions. He said that those consequences would be significant, but he wanted her to understand something far more important than prison time. He wanted her to understand that she had not been convicted because she was a senator's daughter. She had been convicted because she had made choices, free choices, choices made by a grown woman who knew the difference between right and wrong and who chose wrong because she believed consequences didn't apply to her. He said that the law existed not to punish privilege, but to protect the vulnerable. And on the night of March 14th, Patricia and Miguel and Isabella Reyes had needed protection. They had needed someone to make the simple choice not to get behind the wheel while intoxicated. Victoria had failed them, and now she would answer for that failure. He dismissed the jury with thanks for their service, and then he did something that no one expected. He stepped down from the bench and walked toward the gallery. He walked past the stunned attorneys. He walked past the reporters furiously taking notes. He walked past Senator Caldwell, who looked at him with a mixture of hatred and disbelief. He walked to where Isabella Reyes sat in her wheelchair, her aunt holding her hand. And Judge Joseph Wapner, 71 years old with a Bronze Star and 38 years on the bench, knelt down in front of a 10-year-old orphan and spoke to her quietly. The microphones didn't capture what he said, the cameras couldn't read his lips, but those who were close enough to see described the moment as the most human thing they had ever witnessed in a courtroom. Isabella nodded at whatever he said, and then she smiled, just slightly, just for a moment, the first smile anyone had seen from her since the night her family died. Judge Wapner stood, nodded to the aunt, and walked out of the courtroom without another word. Victoria Ashworth Caldwell was sentenced to 15 years in state prison. It was the maximum allowed under the law. She would be eligible for parole after serving 12 years. Senator Raymond Caldwell's political career ended that day. He announced his resignation 2 weeks after the verdict, citing personal reasons. He never held public office again. His wife filed for divorce within a year. The Caldwell family's attempts to appeal the verdict failed at every level. Their claims of judicial bias were dismissed. Their arguments about procedural errors were rejected. The conviction stood. Victoria entered the California Institution for Women in Corona on a Tuesday morning. There were no cameras, no reporters, no designer clothes, just a white van, a pair of handcuffs, and a number that would be her identity for the next decade. According to those who encountered her in the prison system, Victoria's arrogance didn't survive the first week. The women she was incarcerated with didn't care about her last name. They didn't care about her father's money. They cared about what she had done, and they made sure she knew exactly how they felt about people who killed children and showed no remorse. Isabella Reyes underwent countless surgeries and years of physical therapy. She would never walk again, but she refused to let that define her. With the help of her aunt and a community that rallied around her, she graduated high school with honors. She went to college. She became an advocate for victims of drunk driving accidents. On the 10th anniversary of the accident, Isabella gave a speech at a national conference on traffic safety. She spoke about her mother's kindness. She spoke about her brother's dreams. She spoke about the moment that changed everything. And she spoke about a judge who had taught her that justice, real justice, was still possible in America, that no one was truly above the law. That even the most powerful could be held accountable if good people refused to look away. Judge Joseph Wapner passed away in 2017. His legacy extended far beyond the famous television show he would later host. It lived in the countless lives he had touched, in the precedents he had set, in the message he had sent to every powerful person who believed the rules didn't apply to them. Justice was not for sale, and in his courtroom, everyone was equal. The story of Victoria Caldwell and Judge Joseph Wapner became required study in law schools across the country. It was analyzed in courses on judicial ethics. It was cited in articles about wealth and accountability. It became shorthand for a particular kind of courtroom moment, the moment when privilege meets principle and principle wins. But the true lesson of the case wasn't about punishment. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about the satisfaction of watching a wealthy defendant face consequences. The true lesson was about choices. Every person in that courtroom had made choices that led them to that moment. Patricia Reyes had chosen to become a nurse, to dedicate her life to helping others. Isabella had chosen, even in her darkest moments, to keep living, to keep fighting, to keep believing. Judge Wapner had chosen, every single day for nearly 4 decades, to uphold the law without fear or favor. Victoria Caldwell had made her choices too. She had chosen to drink. She had chosen to drive. She had chosen in the 18 months between the accident and the trial to show no genuine remorse, no real transformation, no authentic humanity. Those choices had consequences, and in a functioning justice system, those consequences applied to everyone. The courtroom video from Victoria's trial has been viewed over 50 million times. People watch it when they need to believe that the system can work. They watch it when they need to see arrogance confronted with truth. They watch it when they need to remember that there are still people like Judge Wapner who cannot be bought, intimidated, or fooled. In the final analysis, Victoria Caldwell wasn't destroyed by Judge Wapner. She was destroyed by herself, by her own words, her own actions, her own inability to see other human beings as worthy of consideration. Judge Wapner simply held up a mirror, and he made sure everyone could see what was reflected there. That is the true power of justice, not to punish but to reveal, not to revenge but to recognize, not to tear down the powerful but to lift up the truth. And on that Tuesday morning in Los Angeles, the truth was finally, undeniably, completely revealed. Victoria Caldwell walked into the courtroom believing she was untouchable. She walked out with nothing left to hide behind. No money could save her, no connections could protect her, no family name could erase what everyone had seen. She was simply a person who had made terrible choices, and she was finally being held accountable. That is what justice looks like. And thanks to Judge Joseph Wapner, we all got to see it. When historians look back at this case, they will not remember the fancy lawyers or the political connections. They will not focus on the money spent or the influence wielded. They will remember a simple truth that played out in an ordinary courtroom on an ordinary Tuesday. No one is above the law, not the senator's daughter, not the billionaire's heir, not the connected, the powerful, or the privileged. Judge Joseph Wapner understood this truth at his core. He didn't need to shout it. He didn't need to lecture. He simply lived it, decision by decision, case by case, year by year. And when Victoria Caldwell stood before him, armed with the best lawyers money could buy and the confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences, she discovered what so many had discovered before her. In Judge Wapner's courtroom, the only thing that mattered was the truth. Victoria had built her defense on lies, manipulation, and the assumption that her last name would protect her. Judge Wapner dismantled that defense without ever raising his voice. He asked questions, he observed, he waited, and then with surgical precision he exposed the emptiness at the center of her carefully constructed facade. The moment she admitted she wished she had taken a different route to avoid being caught, her fate was sealed, not by the judge, not by the prosecution, but by her own words, revealing her own soul. Isabella Reyes still speaks about that day. She speaks about watching the woman who killed her family finally face justice. She speaks about the moment Judge Wapner knelt down to talk to her. She says he told her that her mother and brother would be proud of how strong she was being. She says those were the first words that made her believe she could survive. That is the legacy of Judge Joseph Wapner, not the verdicts, though they were fair. Not the sentences, though they were just, but the humanity he brought to a system that often forgets what it's supposed to protect. Victoria Caldwell served her time. She was released in 2025, a different person by all accounts. Whether that transformation was genuine or simply another performance remains to be seen. But the lesson she taught the world remains permanent. You cannot buy justice. You cannot intimidate truth. You cannot perform your way past accountability. And if you walk into a courtroom with arrogance instead of remorse, someone like Judge Wapner will be there, waiting, watching, ready to reveal exactly who you really are.